The most insane punishments during the Nanking event. Being the capital of China at the time, Nanking, now named Nanjing, fell to Japanese troops on December 13, 1937, sparking massive crimes known as the Nanking Massacre, the Rape of Nanking, and in Japan, the Nanking Incident. What happened in Nanking was not worse than what we call punishment. So let's look at some of the insane and horrific instances which took place during the massacre. Matsui Iwane, who was serving as the commanding general of the Japanese Central China Front Army, issued the order that led to the destruction of Nanjing. Matsui's orders were followed by Japanese soldiers who were responsible for a large number of deaths en masse and tens of thousands of rapes. Massacre. Following the surrender of Nanking, Japanese troops are said to have engaged in massacres for a period of 6 weeks, according to tales provided by eyewitnesses from the time period. During this particular episode, a number of war crimes were committed, including the murder of civilians and prisoners of war, rape, looting, and arson. It's unknown how many nationalist soldiers were trapped inside the walled city and disguised themselves as civilians. However, a significant number of civilians, including women and children, were killed during the conflict. The testimony originated from a variety of sources, the most frequently mentioned of which were written by Westerners who remained in China after the war's conclusion in order to shield Chinese citizens from the potential for damage, such as the journals kept by John Rabe and Minnie Vautrin. John McGee, an American missionary, remained in the area after the massacre to create a 16mm film documentary and to take images from first-hand experience. The field journals of Japanese military forces, the testimonials of Japanese soldiers that were collected at a later period by Japanese veterans organizations, and first-person testimonies of survivors of the massacre are some more examples. Immediately following the fall of the city on November 22nd, a group of foreign expatriates led by John Rabe formed the 15-man International Committee and drew up the Nanking Safety Zone in order to protect the lives of civilians living in the city, which had a population of between 200 and 250,000 at the time. If this refugee zone hadn't been established, it's possible that the number of civilians who lost their lives would have been far greater. Rabe and another American missionary named Lewis S.C. Smythe, who was also a professor of sociology at the University of Nanking, documented atrocities committed by Japanese troops and continually filed reports of complaints with the Japanese embassy. Rabe was also the secretary of the International Committee. Murder. As soon as the city fell, Japanese troops immediately began a frantic search for former soldiers. During this search, thousands of young men, both civilians and combatants, were taken prisoner. Several of the prisoners were transported to the Yangtze River, where they were executed by machine guns before having their bodies transported to Shanghai. Many were herded away and executed in large groups. According to the reports, others were used for live bayonet practice. Decapitation used to be a common means of execution, but other, more brutal techniques included burning, nailing victims to trees, or hanging them by their tongues. Some of the victims had their deaths caused by beatings. In addition, the Japanese carried out summary executions of a great number of pedestrians on the streets, with the primary justification being that they might be soldiers disguising themselves as civilians. Women and children were not exempt from the atrocities that were committed during the killings. First, numerous women were cruelly raped, and then they were murdered. It is revolting that civilians are being slaughtered. I could go on, filling pages with accounts of rape and brutality that are nearly beyond comprehension. 2 bayoneted cases are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers entered without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number before wounding the other 2 who made it to the hospital. Not only did they execute every prisoner they could discover, but they also executed a large number of regular residents of varying ages. Just the day before yesterday, we watched a miserable individual being put to death pretty close to the property in which we are currently residing. This quote from a letter written by John McGee to his wife on December 19th. They, speaking of the Japanese forces, bayoneted one young kid to death, and this morning I spent an hour and a half tending to another young boy of 8 years old who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that had entered his stomach and exposed a section of his omentum. This from a letter written by Robert Wilson to his family on December 18th. Rape and behavior with the women and children. During the daytime hours, rapes were frequently carried out in public, frequently in the presence of the victim's spouse or other family members. A significant number of them were carried out in a methodical manner by troops who went from house to house looking for young ladies. Many of the women were taken captive, gang raped, and then killed shortly after, frequently by mutilation. This procedure was systemized. Any form of resistance would result in the immediate firing of weapons. Although the number of rapes reached its highest point just after the city was taken by the Japanese, the practice remained throughout the occupation. It's a dreadful tale to tell, and I have no idea where to start or where to stop telling it. Never before have I heard of or read of something so horrible. Rape. Rape and rape. We assume that there are at least 1,000 cases each night and many each day. If there is any resistance or anything that even remotely resembles disagreement, you'll be shot or stabbed with a bayonet. This from a letter written by James McCallum to his family on December 19, 1937. It is said that Japanese soldiers tied the legs of pregnant women who were in labor so that both the women and their children would perish in excruciating anguish. Since they refused to have sex with Japanese soldiers, many of these women were subjected to horrific forms of torture, including being electrocuted, having their breast amputated, or being burned with cigarettes. The Japanese secret police, known as the Kempeitai, were notorious for their use of excessive force. The harshness of the Japanese government inspired the people of the area to begin resistance movements. Stealing and setting fires. It's estimated that at least 1/3 and possibly even 2/3 of the city was destroyed as a result of deliberate fires started by arsonists. It's not quite clear whether the departure of nationalists or Japanese from the city was the source of this conflict. Despite this, there was a significant amount of damage done to the areas outside the city walls. Troops plundered not only the wealthy, but also the destitute during this time period. Immediately after the city fell, Japanese soldiers were granted complete freedom of movement across the surrounding countryside. As a direct consequence of this, there was rampant theft and looting. And in response to an embargo placed on scrap metal by the United States, Japanese soldiers collected any piece of metal they could get their hands on, including the hinges off of doors. The torturing of innocent civilians. Killing of Chinese citizens by the Imperial Japanese Army continued for the full 6 weeks that the massacre lasted. They killed with extreme cruelty and brutality, and they frequently subjected their victims to torturous treatment before taking their lives. An ex-soldier by the name of Nagatone admitted that Japanese forces put victims to death by various forms of torture, including putting them into kettles that were already boiling with water. They were put to death by suffocation after being buried while they were still conscious. They were buried with only their heads exposed, ensuring that they would perish from starvation. Infants were thrown into the air and bayonets were used to grab them. A documentary film titled The Nanking Massacre was created by a Japanese woman named Tamaki Matsuoka in the year 2010. In the movie, former members of the IJA confess that they routinely committed acts of sexual violence against Chinese women and massacred Chinese citizens. Matsuoka conducted interviews with a total of 250 former troops, but only 3 of them expressed regret for their actions in the past. So that's all for this video. We'll be right back with more. If you want to see more such videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel, and thanks for watching.